invitation from Father Chris is like getting a 3-line whip, so how can I say no? I noticed as I was coming up that there are 2 of the small posters on the platform here that tell us that we have to act justly. And it reminded me of the story of the lady whose husband was coming up to retirement, and she went to commission a portrait of her husband. And she said to the artist, this is a photograph of him, he's a bit jagged and ragged at the edges these days, but she said, do your best to, the artist said to her, I will do my best to do him justice. And she said in reply, no, just be merciful. But there's a serious point, isn't there, that justice and mercy all the way through the New and the Old Testaments go hand in hand. So it's right that these 2 posters should say justice and act justly. Now, there's another story I want to tell before I get going. And this is a story about a Franciscan, a Dominican, and a Jesuit. Now, they were sitting together in a room like this, and the technology was also a bit wobbly, and suddenly all the lights went out. So the Franciscan said, don't worry, I'm going to pray. So the Franciscan started to pray and said, Brother Sun, Sister Moon, please provide us light. Sadly, nothing happened. The Dominican said, you've got the wrong approach. I'm going to preach. So he preached on the text that we should be salt and light. Sadly, again, nothing happened. The Jesuit said, just hold on a moment. And the Jesuit went out of the room, and suddenly all the lights came on. So he walked back in, and they said, well, what did you do? He said, well, I changed the fuse. Now, this is not to dismiss the importance of prayer, the importance of preaching, but also the importance of practicality, and all those things run hand in hand, rather like mercy and justice being like the brother and the sister. These things are needed together. It's not one thing or the other. Jared probably has a copy somewhere of Joyce Huggitt's wonderful book, which is called Listening to God. And she said, I'm an evangelical Christian, and she describes the reasons why. But then she goes on to say, I'm a contemplative Christian, and goes on to explain the reasons why. And then she says, I'm a charismatic Christian, and goes on to explain the reasons why. But all these gifts are needed in the church. So we act justly, but we have to act mercifully as well. And we need the different charisms that people bring to the table. And in this year, the Jesuit who's been changing the fuse, Pope Francis, is not saying that everything is wrong, but something needs renewing, that sometimes you have to put some new energy into your institutions, into the worship, into the schools that we run, into all of the things that are extraordinary things that the church does anyway, that sometimes you have to change the fuse. And so this year, he has said, this is a year of mercy, and that the name of God itself is mercy. In his central exhortation, Evangelium Gaudium, the joy of the gospel, and in subsequent discourses, he says, Jesus is the most important message. Sometimes we make life so complicated that we forget the central message, or we make ourselves the message. And that's always a danger, of course, in this life. So keeping centered on Jesus is what Pope Francis tells us to do as we change the fuse. In the name of God is mercy. Scholars of the law who live attached to the letter of the law, but who neglect love, says the Pope. Men who only know how to close doors and draw boundaries. He uses the metaphor, which I love, of the church being a field hospital for the wounded, for the hurt, where all can find forgiveness and mercy, especially those who are the most wounded. So a field hospital in the midst of all the horrors that go on in our world around us. That is what he says we must be in this year of mercy. Of course, every man and woman, as we learn... Well, if that wasn't changing the fuse, I don't know what was. It was changing the microphone. I wonder if that will hold on. I did say to Chris just before we started that old Nick delights in messing up things like microphones and audio equipment and all the rest of it. Anyway, you won't get the better on this occasion. Every person, as it says in the book of Genesis, is made in the image of God, from the womb to the tomb. We are all created in God's likeness, regardless of our abilities, our gender, orientation, our colour, our creed. It's all irrelevant. We are made in the image of God. Beyond all else comes the individual person in his wholeness and dignity, says the Pope in this year of mercy. The human dignity of every person, imago Dei, made in the image of God. Well, what might that mean? Well, this is what the Church has always taught. So this isn't a new idea suddenly dreamt up. This is about changing the fuse. This is about recharging the batteries, feeding the hungry. We just prayed for in that modern interpretation of the Beatitude. Giving drink to the thirsty, clothing the naked, harbouring the harbourless, visiting the sick, ransoming the captive, burying the dead, instructing the ignorant, counselling the doubtful, admonishing sinners, bearing wrongs patiently, forgiving offences willingly, the theme of Father Chris's book, comforting the afflicted, and praying for the living and the dead. These are the corporal works of mercy, the spiritual works we are called on to engage in at a practical level. Francis says that when we reach out to the refugee or the homeless, and you'll be hearing more about that, I know, later in the day, or to immigrants who have survived the crossing and who land on our shores, we should touch the very flesh of Christ, in whom the outcast, the hungry, the thirsty, the naked, the imprisoned, the ill, the unemployed, the persecuted are searching for refuge. So this morning I want to talk about 3 examples taken from his list. Those examples are contemporary outcasts. The second example are refugees. And the third example, the persecuted. How we can put those corporal works of mercy into some kind of effect in our own times, in our own world, in our own places, even on a one-to-one basis. Just because you can't solve the problems of the entire world, it's not the reason we're not trying to solve any of them. Reaching out one by one is the key. Mother Teresa always emphasized that. She said the small ripple effect stretches throughout the ocean. Or put another way, the Jewish rabbi who said the person who saves a single person saves the entire world. So I think there's truth in those ideas, that we do what we can in our own place. You know, I use the metaphor of the small stone, but the small stone has to move for a landslide to happen. So we make a difference in whatever ways we can in our individual circumstances. So let me take this first example of the thrown away in contemporary society, the discarded, the outcast. Children aren't loved. They're killed before they're being born, says Pope Francis. The elderly are thrown away because they don't produce those people in the September of their lives that we prayed about earlier. Francis warned parents on the consequences of using prenatal testing to screen out for selective abortion, with some parents choosing, he said, to return the baby before it comes into the world. Only a week ago, my colleague, Kevin Shinkwin, Lord Shinkwin, significantly disabled man who is a member of the House of Lords, a Catholic, who is deeply committed in his faith, introduced a bill in Parliament saying you should not have a discriminatory clause even in the Abortion Act that allows a baby to be aborted up to and even during its birth because of a disability. So within the outcasts are without other outcasts, even more so. So 90% in this country of ours, 90% of all babies with Down syndrome are aborted through prenatal testing even before they are born. Next year will be 50 years since we changed the laws. Every single day, around 600 of our babies are aborted. That's a total of 8 million. Mary Warnock, our great philosopher, says about the other end of life in favour of euthanasia. She says, if you're demented, if you have Alzheimer's, you're wasting people's lives, your family's lives, you're wasting the resources of the NHS. This is frightening and chilling, but it's the same philosophy that underpins the throwing away, the discarding of human life at the other end of the spectrum too. Is this about judging and condemning? No, of course it's not. Many women feel they have no choice. I talk about my right to choose, but it's in fact the reality that people are pushed, pressurised, and given no assistance or help. And so that's surely what mercy is about. It's standing alongside people. I heard a story only this week. A young man had phoned me about a girl who works in his office and who was going to have an abortion because she'd been made pregnant and the boy didn't want to know. And he was asking for prayers about this, and people did pray. And I said to him, but also tell her about the possibilities of support and help through organisations like Life to see her through a time of crisis. She went to the abortion clinic, but she turned around, and he told me she changed her mind. The person who saves a single life saves the world. In 1935, the person after whom many of those clinics is named, Mary Stokes, said this: "No one should allow the diseased, the racially negligent," and she had the Irish and Jews particularly in mind, by the way, in that phrase, "the careless, the feeble-minded, and the very lowest and worst members of the community to produce innumerable tens of thousands of warped and inferior infants. Is this Imago Dei? Is this seeing the image of God in our brothers and our sisters? We export from this country through our aid programs money to organisations in China, for instance, that aid and abet the one-child policy, the only country in the world where it's illegal to have a brother or a sister. And the one-child policy has led to forced coercive acts against women, like Mrs. Gao-Duan, who ran an abortion clinic but escaped and gave evidence to a parliamentary committee. A baby of 9 months gestation had poison injected into its skull and the child died and was thrown in a trash can. Why? Because it was born above the limit of only one child. The Independent newspaper reported the case of a wonderful man whom I've hosted now at Westminster. He spent 4 years in prison, a blind, barefoot lawyer, self-taught lawyer called Chen Guangcheng. Why did he get sent to jail? Because he exposed what happened in the Shandong province, where 120,000 women had been coerced into having their child destroyed. Some of those babies were 9 months gestation. China's culture of death has led to genocide. There are now 117 boys for every 100 girls. So there is an issue here, clearly, about why and how we aid and abet these things. What are we doing? In 1906, the great Catholic writer G.K. Chesterton said in his book Orthodoxy, to admire mere choice is to refuse to choose. So we don't elevate choice, we elevate life. Imago Dei, lives made in the image of God. Let me give you 1 or 2 examples of where this kind of new brutalism is going. 2 senior Catholic midwives in Glasgow have lost their jobs because they refuse to participate in an abortion. Now, this isn't the USSR. This isn't some authoritarian dictatorship in some far-flung part of the world. These are 2 lovely women, Scottish women, who have lost their jobs because they were called by vocation to be midwives and because they refused to take the life of an unborn child. They believed, as I believe, and I suspect many of you do, that you have a duty of care and love to both a mother and a child, and that doctors and nurses and midwives should be able to exercise their right to conscience. But do we speak out for them? Do we care very much about their defence of the outcast, their defence of the discarded? John Paul II, in his encyclical Evangelium Vitae, said everyone has the right to life, upon recognition of which every human community and the political community are founded. He said to claim the right to things like euthanasia or infanticide or abortion, and to recognise that right in law, means to attribute to human freedom a perverse, evil significance, that of absolute power over others and against others. And he said that's the death of true freedom. To admire mere choice is to refuse to choose. The second example I want to give, having talked about the discarded in this year of mercy, the outcast, the vulnerable, the voiceless, whom nobody else will speak for, are another group, refugees. All of us every day are horrified by what we see coming out of Aleppo and other parts of Syria and Iraq. Even while we're meeting today, the bombing of Aleppo continues and the assault on Mosul in Iraq continues. And what is that doing? It's creating even more refugees, inevitably. Syria has claimed the lives of over 250,000 people, around about 50,000 every year. And there are now around 7.5 million people displaced within Syria's borders, and of course many more outside it. And we've seen what happens. Pope Francis, of course, visited Lampedusa at the very beginning of his papacy in order to proclaim the atrocities occurring in the Mediterranean, which he said had become one vast cemetery as a consequence of Eritreans, other North Africans, Nigerians and others escaping from North Africa. And then in the Aegean we saw the same thing as Syrians trying to escape from Turkey to come into the European Union. But the same story is also true for escaping Muslims, Rohingya Muslims trying to escape from Myanmar, Burma, cast adrift in rickety boats in in the Andaman Sea. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees has told countries like our own that they must shoulder their fair share in responding to the refugee crisis at home and abroad. As recently as last week, I raised the plight of the 80,000, this is a figure provided by Europol, 80,000 children who are estimated to now be adrift, without parents, on the European continental landmass. I raised the plight of the 10,000 who have completely disappeared, and I gave a specific case of a little boy and girl, brother and sister, aged 12 and 13, Syrians whose parents have died in Aleppo, who are orphans, and remember what the Bible tells us about prioritizing our care for the widow and the orphan, and those two children are sleeping on a derelict forecourt of a former petrol station under canvas in a small tent, open to abuse, open to exploitation, to trafficking and all the other horrors that go with it. Surely we should be doing what Sir Nicholas Winton did during the Second World War with kinder transport, where he rescued over 600 Jewish children. He prioritised. So no, we can't take everyone, but we are certainly not taking the most vulnerable and the needy at this time. We must do more. Small city-states, I've argued, like a new Carthage or places like Indonesia, need to be created on the coast of the Mediterranean. Safe havens and refuges where people can earn a living, where we create new industries, new technologies and so on. Putting solar panels across the whole of the Sahara Desert to create energy for the world in a way that doesn't create carbon dioxide. It's a way of creating jobs. It would keep people in places where, by and large, they want to stay if there wasn't violence and war. Places they would stay if there was an opportunity for work and advancement. My mother was an immigrant. My mother's first language was Irish. And her parents died, I never met them, in poverty-related diseases in the west of Ireland. She escaped with her brothers and sisters, scattered to the winds at a very young age. She arrived in this country, which gave her a great and good home. It's how she met my father. And I was born in a slum clearance area in the East End of London at that time, and brought up in a loving and very fortifying atmosphere with the love of my parents, with the love of the community, and the values of this nation. And I want to see the same for others who are here, who are strangers in our land. I want to see them cherished and loved and help to integrate into our community in the way that my generation and people from my background were able to do. If you really want to deal with Daesh, with ISIS, then you do it by constructive, positive means, and not simply by aerial bombardment. I think it was Einstein's definition of insanity, was doing the same thing over and over and over again. And whether it's in that first group I talked about or this group, we just do the same thing very ineffectively. Our history tells us many things, not least that the innocent always suffer the most when we crack the thin veneer that separates anarchy and chaos on one hand from civilization. Only a generation ago, Europe itself was driven by horrific war, driven by racist xenophobia, secular ideology, and 2 days ago it was the International Day of Religious Freedom. Where did the ideas of religious and political freedom come from? The Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Where did that come from in 1948? It came out of the smouldering ovens of Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen and the rest. Have we forgotten all the lessons of that terrible time of our history? International law, even if you don't accept the imperatives of mercy and the proclamations of men like Pope Francis, international law imposes a duty on us to protect those who are victims of genocide. The first Armenian genocide took place in 1915 in the area around Aleppo. It's happening all over again. We say never again, it happens all over again. The slow burn genocide that began in 1915 carries on to this day. I was with earlier this week some Yazidi women. If you read last week's Sunday Times and the report by Christina Lamb, who for 30 years has been an incredibly courageous war correspondent, and you learn what has been done to those Yazidis because they are different. If you learn about what has happened to Christians in Syria and Iraq because they are different, this is genocide. This isn't just war crimes, bad and terrible as those are. This isn't just persecution. This is genocide in anybody's definition of that word. That is why the House of Commons voted to declare it as such. So did the US House of Representatives, so did the Australian House of Representatives, so did the European Parliament, so did the Council of Europe's Parliamentary Assembly. But who hasn't accepted it as genocide? The British government, and many other governments too. Because if you accept that this is the law, it imposes a legal duty on you to protect, to prevent, and to punish those responsible. The rule of law should be key for us in this, not the rule of bombardment. And I passionately believe, as I said at the outset, that mercy has to be accompanied by justice, and it is not being. In 1888, a children's parlour game was invented. It was called, and many of you will have played it with your children or grandchildren, or when you were small, it was called Pass the Parcel. A lighted candle was passed along a row of people. The first recipient says, "Jack's alive and likely to live. If he dies in your hand, you have a forfeit to give." I think that our response to the refugee crisis has been like a bad-tempered game of pass the parcel, countries hoping that their neighbours will have to bear the brunt, with their neighbours having to take the political consequences. Now, that is not how people should be living. We should be sharing our responsibilities. We go on endlessly about our rights. My right to do this and that and the other. Me, my, I at the heart of the equation. My rights, entitlements, not my duties, responsibilities, obligations, choices, consequences matter more. In his encyclical Deus Caritas Est, God is love, Pope Benedict said that the abject poverty and injustice that is often the reason why people start to become migrants is an offence against humanity and dignity. The conditions being suffered, he said, by such large numbers of people are such as to offend the dignity of human beings and as a consequence to compromise the authentic and harmonious progress of the world community. He said the Church cannot and must not remain on the sidelines in the fight for justice, the promotion of justice through efforts to bring about openness of mind and will to the demands of the common good. Common good, the phrase that Christians have used down the ages, is something which concerns the Church deeply. So, I've said something about the discarded. I've said something about the refugees and the migrants. I want to end on my third point by talking about the persecuted. As I said, on Thursday was International Day of Religious Freedom, and yet all over the world people are persecuted or discriminated against or even suffering genocide as a result of their faith. In the 1930s, a Jewish writer called Franz Werfel wrote an extraordinary book called The 40 Days on Muzadag. Translated, it means 40 days on Moses' mountain. It's a novel, but it's based on truth, and it's a brilliant, brilliant novel. And you can read it, it's on Amazon and so on. And I read it last summer, and it was almost talking to me about now rather than then. Franz Werfel, his books were so hated by Hitler, because Hitler was by then planning his final solution against Jews. And he said, who now remembers the Armenians? The world had very quickly forgotten about the deaths of 1 million Christians. He said, we will have his books burnt. And they were burnt in that orgy of burnings that Hitler was responsible for. Hans Werfel, incidentally, went on to become a Christian, a Catholic, and he wrote the Song of Bernadette, amongst other things.